So thanks for attending the What Did We Learn series. Today we're going to be talking about the upgrading from Magento 2. We have quite a few lessons learned. Actually going to be having a good panel conversation here with the team. So I have a couple of people that I want to introduce, and I am going to take this down and share my screen and let us introduce each other. So Terrence, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Terrence McDevitt. I'm a senior solution architect with Bluefish. I spent maybe the last 8 years or so working on large-scale e-commerce solutions, mainly focused on B2B. And my job is really all about making sure that we're building the right solutions for our clients. So really trying to understand their requirements, their constraints, their needs, and making sure that we're implementing the right technologies for that. I've been involved in a number of M1, M2 upgrades, and I'll be talking through our experiences on the call.
Great.
Gary?
Thanks. I'm Gary Smith. I work with Nexus. We do managed application hosting, including Magento. And my job is I'm a channel manager. I work with our great partners like Bluefish and help implement solutions for Magento hosting. My own background in a nutshell is I have been a merchant, got in on Magento 1 in the very early days as a merchant myself, and also worked with another agency helping to manage projects in Magento 1 and later Magento 2. So been involved in the Magento community for about 10 years. Thanks for the invite.
Great. Thanks, Gary. I'm Tricia Foster. I'm going to be the moderator today. And so I've been with Bluefish several years. I've been in the e-commerce business pretty much most of my career, also mainly in the Magento space, in the marketing and the merchandising side of Magento for several companies, and then also from an agency perspective. So I worked really closely with Terrence. So I'm super excited about today's session. So talk a little bit about things that we've learned. So let's just dive on in. We've got a lot to cover in a very short period of time, so I'm going to try to keep us on track. Let's talk a little bit about the timing of this this discussion. You know, Magento's ended their support for M1 in June of last year. Why are we talking about this today?
Yeah, I can jump in. That's great question. When we sat down to think about the types of things that we wanted to talk about in a webinar, we talked about M2 upgrades and said, hey, it feels a little late for that, right? To your point, June of last year was the end of life date for Magento 1. And that was after years of Magento sort of gently, saying, okay, it's time to get off M1 and onto M2. They extended that deadline a couple times. And June really was the drop dead date for that. So, they finally did it last summer. And, despite that, we're still seeing a good number of prospects come in that are still stuck on M1 for a variety of reasons. We'll talk about those in a little bit. But, they're still looking for a path forward. And, of course, we're wanting to help them with that. I think we did a little bit of digging on this, and really the numbers were surprising on how many folks are still on M1. There's literally thousands of sites that are out there today that are live on M1 still, even though the date was last June. And some of those are significant retailers. They're doing hundreds of thousands of dollars of business a year. And so there's definitely a market for folks out there to be upgrading from M1 to M2. When we spoke, about this earlier, when Gary and Tricia and I were talking about this, we talked about the fact that the numbers that we have in terms of revenue numbers are only what we know about online revenue, but we suspect that a good number of the M1 folks are kind of traditional B2B businesses. So more of their work might not even be online. It might actually be kind of old school processes, and maybe they have a small web presence or something like that. Yeah. What do you think, Gary?
I think there's a ton of that out there where there are companies that are still kind of sticking a toe in the water in B2B e-commerce. They're still trying to understand that process, still using manual processes, having their customers phone in or fax in orders, as quaint as it may sound, but it's often difficult to re-engineer those business processes to work in e-commerce, but that's increasingly the position that they're finding themselves in. And, it's time to start doing that.
Absolutely. So for the guys that are behind the curve, what are the implications?
Yeah, that's a good question. The folks that are still on M1, the good news is their sites are still going to function. That's not really an issue. So even though it's end of life, it's not like there's a license or something that gets cut off and they can't continue to sell. So that's good. Adobe and Magento have, basically said once we did EOL, we're done providing technical support. And that includes security updates. So there's a real risk there for some of those merchants. If they're sitting on M1, even if they're on the latest and greatest up until June 2020, security vulnerabilities come out all the time. And so there's certainly a chance that they would be at risk there. Magento also ended the support for PHP compatibility in M1 in November of 2020. And so there may be vulnerabilities there that would need to be considered. So those are I think really the risks are mainly around security, and that's obviously can be significant.
So based on that, what are the options that people have if they're not able to move right away to M2? I mean, sometimes it takes planning, it takes process. So
yeah, it takes a ton of time for sure. We'll talk about that, I think, a little bit later. But if you've got, we've come across a number of merchants that have in-house development teams, technical folks. And if you're a merchant that's like that and you've got a skilled development team, then for sure that team could potentially address those security vulnerabilities as they come up, right? But if they're also being tasked with actually upgrading the store to M2, then that's just taking away from their time to upgrade. So while that's possible, it just doesn't seem like an ideal solution for them.
yeah.
A better option is something, I'm glad Gary's on the call, because Nexus actually has an offering for something like this. It's called their Safe Harbor program. And it's really built for this very scenario where a merchant has an M1 store and they're just stuck and they can't get to M2 quick enough. Gary, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you're talking about the length of time it takes to re-platform. Everybody who's looking to make that jump, it will be an involved process. There's just no way around that. So Nexus developed Safe Harbor late 2019, early 2020 was about the time we rolled this out. We saw that end of life was coming. A lot of people in the community talked about, maybe Magento will roll that back. Perhaps they won't pull the trigger in the middle of June 2020. But honestly, from their perspective, the time had honestly come. And despite, difficulties in the world, you gotta make the end of it sometime. Magento 2 had been out 2 or 3 years. The impact of Safe Harbor, or the idea behind Safe Harbor, was really to provide patches. I'll just kind of say aftermarket patches. After Adobe and Magento quit releasing them, we are developing patches and also finding patches that are out there in the community to provide for updated software patches to address vulnerabilities as they arose and were discovered. We've released 3 or 4 or 5 of those since June 2020. We also do things in the hosting environment simply to mitigate vulnerability for things like ports. You've got open ports, you've got services that may have been set up in Magento 1 that at one point may have been a good idea to have open, but now we recognize that, for example, we need to close this service off and not allow it to be used to just avoid a point of attack.
We're gonna have to move on a little bit.
Okay.
A little bit behind.
Okay, that's fine. One last thing I'll say about that is simply, just providing development environments. Everybody should have a development environment, but sometimes M1 merchants don't. So we provide that as well.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So it's nice to know that there's some options for people who are going to stay on M1 for a little while they're upgrade. But while that's happening, and preparing for the upgrade, what are some of the things that we need to be that clients need to be thinking about when planning their M2 upgrade? What are some of the kind of key areas that they need to be thinking about?
Yeah, so I hinted at this earlier. There's a lot that goes into this. We could probably talk for an hour about it, but we have a limited amount of time. So I'll go through this quickly. But things like your theme. So your theme in M1 is just not going to port over to M2, unfortunately. And so you have to take that into consideration when you're talking about your planning and your budgeting. You know, timing, from a timing standpoint, these upgrades take months. It's not something that happens in a week or two, especially if you've got, you know, a large number of customizations that you did over an M1 and any integrations that you might have. Just expect it to take months, realistically. What we've seen work quite well is to do what we call a module gap analysis. So really looking at the things that you've done over in your M1 site, because over the years, you've probably built some customizations, you've almost certainly, you know, purchased some modules, and really looking at that list. A lot of times people just go for years and don't even circle back to those modules. So, you know, look at that list of modules, understand what they're doing, understand what your customizations are, and then go see what's possible over in Magento. Maybe Magento has those features out of the box and you don't need them anymore. Or maybe a third-party module that you're using doesn't exist for M2. So now you've got to figure out, you know, what to do there. So that takes definitely some time and some research and some thinking. Other things that we would suggest as part of an upgrade, don't consider an in-place upgrade at all. Like if you're saying, I've got this existing production environment and I'm going to do the upgrade in that environment against that, you know, database, not a good idea. Try to get a new environment stood up that you can work from and then migrate the data between those environments. That's really probably the best option there.
Yeah.
And from a testing standpoint, real quick, just expect a full regression test. It's going to take you a very long time to do this. Make sure that you're investing the time in actually testing.
I'm glad you mentioned that. That is absolutely critical to that. So you talked about performing a gap analysis. Do you have any preferred modules that you're using for M2 implementations, things that people might want to consider? Or?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that we often see, you know, during our development is that you've got, you know, your content in your old environment, you've got content, you know, in your lower environments, like your development environment that you want to get out into what will eventually be the production environment. So we use some modules, third-party modules to help with exporting and importing that content. So you're not sitting there and writing CMS pages in every one of your environments or CMS blocks. Really, really helpful. We are also big fans of some cron job management modules that may not have been really a thing in M1. There's a lot of cron jobs in M2, and it's really nice to be able to have some visibility into that directly from the Magento admin and really understand when things are firing, when they're not, being able to run them manually. We also are big fans of using modules around Elasticsearch, which is, I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but Elasticsearch in Magento 2.4 is required. Really powerful search engine. It's great, but there's some things that you can't necessarily tweak out of the box from the Magento admin, but there are really good modules that let you do that. You know, we're big fans of Google Tag Manager and analytics, of course. And if there's things that you can do with, let's say, GTM, that could help you with your site, if that means tracking activity or user behavior, whatever it might be, leverage that. Don't go build that kind of stuff on your own. And then one really helpful thing, especially after go live for us, is we use a module for a number of our clients where you can log in as the customer. So you can basically impersonate the customer. Really helpful for tracking down issues that might be related to a data migration. We had an example with one of our clients where their carts didn't properly migrate from M1 to M2. And so people that were shopping one day on M1 and we went live on M2 the next day expected to see their carts there. And in some cases they did, in some cases they didn't. So the CSRs from our client could actually log in as those customers to see what was going on and help to debug that problem. So very, very helpful module for us.
That's great. So you mentioned earlier that the theme doesn't carry over from M1 to M2. I know that's been, you know, people who think, oh, all I have to do is just take a look at my current site and I just want it to look exactly like the current site. I know that's probably pretty challenging. Can you expand on that? What are people doing about it? Is this a redesign time? What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, so I definitely touched on that earlier about the fact that the themes from M1 don't come over to M2 automatically. The layouts that you've got in M1 have to be refactored as part of the upgrades. So it's a big deal. It's actually where we've seen most of our time spent on these upgrades. And as a result of that, if it's a site that you've had for a long time and it's a little long in the tooth, then this might be an opportunity to like step back and actually do a design. Now, at the same time, you are challenged because you've got this old M1 site that might be vulnerable And you kind of want to do this as quickly as you can, but if you have some time and you're using something like Nexus Safe Harbor, then, take your time and think about properly doing a redesign and maybe refreshing your site, the look and feel of the site. It's a really good opportunity to do that.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Are there any specific features in M2 that customers can now take advantage of that they really couldn't in M1? Like, to kind of help get them over that hump, like, yes, these are things that we can actually take advantage of now.
Yeah, that's a great question. For our B2B clients, there are actually some really good features in M2 around their B2B module, customer self-service, quick orders, shared catalogs, and really just, the whole mindset of B2B purchasing has just changed a whole lot over the last few years. I think people have this like B2C mindset when they're now doing B2B purchasing. Gary, you had some thoughts on that when we spoke the other day. What do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think one of the impacts when you're doing B2B purchasing is, remember, often it's somebody's job. Like, I used to be in the t-shirt business. Somebody is ordering t-shirts, for printing all day long. And they're specifically trained, if you will, on how I go to this catalog and order. And if you do a redesign and change all that around, well, that's where you really need to do some study on how you're changing that UX. It may be better, but if you make it different, you may make things a little tough for people. It's really a blend of thinking like a consumer, but also realizing that these are like industrial processes sometimes that have to be addressed. It's not like retail.
Yeah, great. A couple other things, Tricia, that we've seen in terms of additional features in M2 that maybe weren't around in M1 or were difficult in M1. Checkout has significantly been improved. Some of the out-of-the-box payment methods that are now available, like Amazon Pay, are now relatively easy to integrate. So that might be something to look at, is giving your customers a little bit more flexibility in how they check out. Performance is better. It's just way better. We've got a client that has 250,000 SKUs. And in M1, that was almost unmanageable in the admin. And now it's no problem at all. They've just revamped everything from indexing to, cron jobs running in a more performant fashion, et cetera. And it really is just making a difference all around. Page Builder, Page Builder doesn't maybe get enough attention, but it should, because it really does make the content editing process and experience just way better than it used to be in M1. In M1, it was go in and use a WYSIWYG editor and edit some markup. Really challenging for some people, right? But Page Builder lets pretty much anyone go in and just drag and drop things in for updates to the site. Really, really helpful. And related to that, something that we love, one of our clients uses this all the time. It's actually core to their business, are scheduled updates. So they manage all of their content and promotions, even product prices and data on scheduled updates. Whereas before in M1, we have one of our clients there, I felt really bad for him. He was up at midnight on Sundays every week, going and manually deploying content and making changes. And now in M2, he can do that ahead of time with scheduled updates, and he just wakes up on Monday morning and it's all there for him. So it's really, really cool.
That makes a big difference.
Yeah.
So looking to post upgrade, anything that merchants should consider after a successful migration? Like, what are the kinds of things that they need to be thinking about, monitoring, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the biggest thing from my perspective is just, like, keep your M1 site around at least for a while, right? We've actually had a situation where the M1 site went away. It was just decommissioned completely, but we needed to get back to data from, and not just in the database. It was like, we really need to see the site up and running and get to the admin and do things like process an invoice on an old order or something. So if you can keep it around, put it on a subdomain, block access to it, turn off any cron jobs you've got running on that server, just so nothing inadvertently runs. And it's really, really helpful. And I would say, keep it around for a few months. And then of course, when you need to really decommission it, take a database backup and that sort of thing. SEO, of course, SEO is probably important to every one of our clients and to anyone who might be thinking about upgrading to M2. And just make sure that you're monitoring performance, SEO performance on a regular basis, just looking at it and saying, okay, do we have any dips? Is there anything unexplained? Like maybe your URL redirects didn't come over properly, and you would know that pretty quickly if you're monitoring your SEO. So don't forget about that. And then site performance. I mentioned earlier that M2 is much faster than M1 in so many aspects, but certainly in your development of your theme or any custom code you've got, you could make things worse than what it is out of the box. And so use tools to monitor that. And we love New Relic. We use it a lot. Nexus has a great integration with New Relic, and it really does give us some really, good visibility into the health of the servers.
I would add, keep monitoring it as it's in production. I think a lot of times there's a lot of attention paid during development. Hey, does the site run good? Okay, great, we're good to go. But then loads increase, or you get more products in there and things could bog down.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know, we've done a number of M2 upgrades in the last years, months. Any of them kind of, really stand out to you, Terrence, that we've done?
Yeah, I've got a few, but I think we only have time to talk about one, unfortunately. But my favorite upgrade was for a client of ours. They've been a client forever, company out of Austin called Texas Supplements. And they've got two brands. They've got a B2B brand and they've got a B2C brand, both of which were hosted on a single Magento 1 instance. And so when we started to think about their M2 upgrade, which was at this point, we started planning for that maybe a year and a half ago. We were well ahead of the curve on that. We all talked about the possibility of just bringing everything over, both brands. And at the time, we just couldn't make that happen. There was a lot going on in their business. They just couldn't really focus, and they're separate parts of their business, completely different people, different, everything. And so we were like, well, we can't really do both of these brands. It's just not going to happen. So in order to really mitigate the risk to their business, we ended up deciding to migrate their B2C brand first. And that was, I think, October of 2019 is when we went live on that. And then we decided to upgrade their B2B site and migrate that over into the same Magento 2 instance last July, I think. So it was several months later. And that really was very challenging because we had this situation where the M2 site was up and running while the old M1 site was up and running, serving the B2B brand. And there were all sorts of things that we had to consider in the migration. And the biggest issue was, well, what do we do about database IDs? Because we've just taken a snapshot of the database to migrate their B2C store, but the old M1 site's still running, still generating database IDs. And if we eventually migrate this guy over into the new Magento 2 site, now we're going to have some clashes that happen. And so we had to take that into consideration, bump all of our IDs up in M2, essentially like artificially inflate them, and really give us a lot of buffer so that when we brought things over from the old B2B site, then we wouldn't have those issues. And that required quite a bit of jumping through hoops and some magic from our team. And we, modified the Magento 2 migration tool a little bit to make that happen. But, at the end of the day, it worked. We were really happy about that. And both of those sites are now on M2 and have been for a while. And, we haven't looked back at all. Our clients are very happy about that. It's actually worked out quite well for them. It's a better site all around. It's more performant. It's got better features that we didn't have over in M1. It's been a pretty cool experience to go through.
Now, did either one of those brands do any kind of a site redesign or?
Yeah, so good question. So we mentioned earlier that this is a good opportunity to redesign your site because you have to rebuild your theme. The B2C site, yes, we took that as an opportunity to redesign. It was a little bit old and we just needed to clean it up a little bit, make it more modern. The B2B site, interestingly, they didn't want us to do that. They actually said, look, we know you have to rebuild the theme anyway, but we still want it to look like the old site. And a lot of that was actually driven by their customers. So their customers are, a little bit older demographic. They kind of know one thing and it's like, that's what I'm used to. And they just didn't want to disrupt their customer base by dramatically changing the design of the site. So they actually opted to rebuild the existing M1 look and feel over on M2. Eventually, we'll probably redesign that, but that wasn't part of the upgrade.
That's interesting. So any of the special features that you've seen in M2 that's kind of made a huge impact to customers?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a bunch. There's one of the other clients that I wanted to talk about was an industrial filter company that we work with. And they're great. They're based out of Tennessee, and they sell replacement filters for these industrial filters that, are in giant machines and big factories. And it's, it's not necessarily the most exciting business around, but some of the things that come in from their customers are really cool. So they are really big on customer service, and their kind of value proposition is that they're really good at finding filters. So again, they replace OEM filters, and they do it with really good filters that are guaranteed to work, and they're cheaper. But they get a lot of customers that email them and say, hey, I've got this filter from this old machine. I can't figure out what it is. Help me find it. And their team's really good at identifying what those filters are. And so we, as part of their upgrade, we implemented a form where they can upload photos, and we get copied on those photos. It's pretty funny. These people have like these dirty filters that they are in the warehouse, and they're taking pictures of it and submitting it on the form. And then their team gets notified, their sales team, and they kick off a workflow and they go follow up on it. And as part of that, they can go back into Magento and create a quote for those customers and approve it. And the customer gets notified, and they can just jump right into the site, and their cart is ready to go with an approved quote, negotiated rate, and then they can go check out. So it's really cool. A lot of that is, it would have been possible in M1, but it would have just taken a whole lot of time. And the fact that we can use the quoting module is really, really helpful.
Wow, that's great. That's great. So this has been, this has been great. If the two of you can like sum up, and we have about 2 minutes left. So sum up in like a 1, 2, 3. What are things people need to think about tonight? Like, what would that be? Like, they're in one right now. So
yeah. I think the number one thing is just protect your site immediately. Like, if you've got an M1 site that's live and it's probably, a little bit out of date at this point, then get it upgraded to the latest M1 from back in June. If you haven't done that, then certainly do that. Get it into a program like Safe Harbor, so that you know that you're going to get some sort of support until you can get onto M2. Be realistic about your upgrade plan. I talked about this earlier. It's going to take time, and it's going to take lots of testing, and really just a commitment, to make it happen, which is probably why so many people haven't upgraded, because it just takes a lot of time, and people know that. But, be realistic about that. And then the last thing I'd say is, don't pave the cow path. If you've got stuff you did in M1 and you're like, we'll just do that again in M2, don't do that. Take this as an opportunity to really look at it and say, what can we clean up? What technical debt can we get rid of, just to make it better? Don't bring any of that into M2 if you don't need to.
is it also kind of a time to do some data cleansing as well? Like,
yeah, for sure. If you've got old orders, that have been sitting out there for years, and you really don't need access to them, get rid of those from your old M1 site, and dump them out to a database, or a spreadsheet or something. And that's one thing. Old customers, for example. Yeah.
Gary, anything from like kind of the last final word here for like kind of a to think about? Like,
yeah, I think about in connection to B2B customers, and I've done industrial sales and that sort of thing. There's a concern about or there's a mindset of like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, which is why I think sometimes people are still on M1, and they have to balance that need to update the processes with, not disorienting those old customers. And that's where it really takes some work from an agency like yours to help them navigate that kind of re-engineering of the business to some extent.
Sure. That makes total sense. Well, I think we are at time. So I thank you guys both very much for the conversation. It was great. I don't know that we have time for questions, but if don't hesitate to either give us a shout or contact us if you have any questions.